Your copy of God's Word back to the book of Daniel. And we are in chapter 11 this morning as we continue our study through this book. Daniel chapter 11, and we will be looking in particular at verses 1 through 30. As you're turning there, let's pray. Oh God, we ask that you would open our eyes to see you and your hand in your word, to see your amazing providence throughout all of history that you have guided according to your own plan, according to your own direction. Oh God, I pray this morning that you would cause us by your word and the Spirit's presence to trust in you more, to love you with all of our hearts, that we might have the hope of Christ ever before our eyes. I pray all these things for your glory, and in his name, amen. Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 through 30. Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes. And he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. And also shall carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. But his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up, even to his fortress. The king of the south shall be moved with choler, and he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. When he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with many riches. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, by which his hand shall be consumed. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her. But she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. After this shall he turn his face upon the isles, and shall take many. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, and he shall stumble and fall and not be found. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes and the glory of the kingdom. But within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches for a time. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed on the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table. But it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. That time appointed he shall return, and come toward the south. But it shall not be as the former or as the latter. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do, even he shall return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Okay. Daniel chapter 11 comes on the heels of Daniel 10, obviously. In Daniel 10 last week, I told you that we've begun what is a new section of the book of Daniel, the last section of the book of Daniel. Chapters 10, 11, and 12 are all related to one another. Chapter 10 introduced the vision by telling us behind all of the things we can see in the world, behind the movement of kings and kingdoms, there is a spiritual force. Now, ultimately, the great spiritual force is God himself, who is directing and guiding all things according to his own goodwill and purposes. But even behind those things, there are also forces of darkness. And last week, we spent a little bit of time talking about angels and demons. The first verse this morning could have gone with chapter 10, and really it serves to end chapter 10, where it says, also I, this again is the angel speaking, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood up to confirm and to strengthen him. The angel then again is speaking of the work he was doing in strengthening God's people, the kingdom God was propping up at that time, which was the Persians, and then in weakening the demonic forces that he was dealing with. So verse 1 isn't really so much our focus this morning, but as you notice, we came to verses 2 through 30. There is a massive amount of detail in these passages. And these passages are at one point somewhat difficult to interpret, but at one point somewhat easy to interpret, because pretty much everybody comes to the same application of these 30 verses. And that is because the 30 verses we're about to look at read almost as a history book. Now keep in mind that Daniel is not writing history. It's so important that we remember that. Daniel is not writing history. What is history? History is the telling of events after the fact. If Daniel is merely writing history here, it's not necessarily all that impressive, right? When we read the history of the kings of Israel in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it doesn't impress us that the author of those books is able to tell us the history. Now, those books are applicable and useful to us in a multitude of ways, but they're not impressive in that someone is telling us something that hadn't happened yet. They're just recapitulating history. And it can be tempting as we read Daniel, and as I'm preaching through Daniel 11 this morning, to just hear and receive these texts as history, because that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through and show that all of these things happened historically in the moving, especially of the empire of the Grecians after the Persians fell away. It can be tempting to do that, but to get the full force of this text, you have to understand Daniel's not writing history. Daniel is writing prophecy. Daniel is writing about these events hundreds of years before they happened. And that is why this is amazing. I began the sermon series in Daniel by saying that the book of Daniel contains some of the singular, most amazing predictive prophecies ever written. We certainly saw that in Daniel chapter 9. You'll remember the 70 weeks of 7 years and the years counting up to the coming of the Messiah, the 3.5 years of the Messiah's ministry, even leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Specific years that are given there. Now, Daniel in his prophecies often moves from more general to more specific. And what we're going to look at today are things we've already talked about in a general sense. We've already talked about Alexander the Great, How when Alexander died, his empire was divided into 4 different Hellenistic kingdoms. We've talked about those things, but now Daniel is giving us specifics. Daniel is going to fill in specifically what is happening. This morning we're going to see what is happening from the time of Daniel, about 535 BC, up to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabean revolt in the middle of the 100s BC. So we're looking at almost 400 years of history, and what is amazing here again is that Daniel is writing before these events took place, and the specificity with which he nails down exact historic details should blow you away. This passages like this, are the reason why liberals say that the book of Daniel couldn't have been written during the life of Daniel. It's the reason that they say the book of Daniel had to have been written after these events took place. Because even liberal secular scholars agree what these passages are about. Believers and unbelievers alike. Whatever side you fall on eschatological matters, there is broad agreement on the application of these texts because, as we're going to see, with a little bit of historic information, it becomes very clear what Daniel is addressing and what Daniel is talking about. But we have to keep in our minds, first, that Daniel is writing prophecy. That's why this is amazing. Isaiah 46 verse 9 says, "Remember the things of old, for I am the Lord, for there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." Last thing before we get into the text itself. It can be easy to hear a message like this with great detail, with great historical information, and say, that's really interesting and all, but what does this mean for me? How can I apply all of this history to my life? We're going to get to that at the end, but launching into it, I want to remind you of what this says about God. If this is true, if Daniel is writing these things hundreds of years before they happened, it tells us something about who the God of the Bible is. It tells us something about how we can trust him and how much we can trust him. We can trust him with every detail of our life because God is sovereign over every detail of history, and he works it according to his own plan. He doesn't just know the future, God has declared the future, and it happens according to that decree and to that plan. All right, now let's begin here in verse 2. We'll see how long we can go, right? There's a lot of information. We'll get as far as the Lord wills for us to get this morning. Verse 2. "Now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece," or Grecia. What are we talking about here? Daniel is living during a time. There are yet 4 kings to come upon the time of Daniel. At Daniel's time, we're talking about the king Cyrus. There are 4 more kings who are coming from Persia. 3 of these kings are somewhat noticeable, but the 4th king in particular, Daniel spends a deal of time on. Those first 3 kings are Cambyses, Smerdis, and Darius the First. Now, we don't have to say much about them, but the 4th king gets more information given. That 4th king is a king known to history as Xerxes, also called in the Bible, many believe, Ahasuerus. So we're talking about that king, the 4th king after King Cyrus. What we note about Xerxes is that Xerxes was far more powerful and far richer than the kings who had come before him. Now, Cyrus, Darius, these great kings were great and wealthy, but when you look at history, what we see about Xerxes, that's absolutely true. Xerxes, upon gaining power, strength, and riches, turns his people against the realm of Greece. That's what verse 2 says, right? Now look at history. What happens in the life of Xerxes? Xerxes, the king of Persia, believed himself to be a god king, that none could stand before him. Xerxes raised an army of about 900,000 men to cross the Hellespont. The Hellespont is one of the straits you can go over from what would be the Asian continent into the European continent. He raised an army of 900,000 men to cross the Hellespont to conquer Greece. This waging of war of Xerxes against the Greeks lasted 2 to 3 years, And at first, Xerxes was somewhat successful. You could think here about the historic Battle of Thermopylae. Maybe you'll be familiar with Thermopylae through the story of the Spartan king Leonidas and his 300 men, which were aided by 700 other Greeks. But Leonidas and his 300 men, with these 700 others behind him, came up against Xerxes and his army of several 100,000. During this battle, in which Xerxes emerged victorious, Xerxes took heavy losses. Those heavy losses began to compound, and eventually Xerxes and his army was totally defeated. Xerxes and his army were forced back over into Persia, and from that point on, the Persians declined in their power. The Persians declined in their influence. For the next 100 years or so, and we're going to skip now, going to verse 3, we skip 130 years in history. The next 100 years or so, Jerusalem lives in relative peace. What you notice about the prophecy of the Bible is that God, he gives prophecy concerning his people. His people are the center of history. You might wonder, why doesn't the Bible talk about what's going on with the Native Americans? Why? Well, if you're a Mormon, you kind of add some things to there. But why doesn't the Bible talk about what's happening in Far East Asia? Why does the Bible spend so little time on Alexander the Great and so much time on the kings of the north and the kings of the south? Well, in the Bible, we are focusing in on God's people, and God's people are the center of his work. Remember, Daniel is all about preparing God's people for difficulty. So we skip over 130 years or so between verses 2 and 3, and those 130 years are the decline of Persia, the rise of Greece, and relative peace for the Jews in and around Jerusalem. Verse 3, a mighty king shall stand up, and that shall rule with a great dominion and do according to his will. Now, we've seen this mighty king before. This mighty king is the great horn from Daniel chapter 8, coming off of the animal that we saw to be Greece, and that was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great has appeared before in Daniel, and he gets a small treatment here because Alexander doesn't actually persecute the Jews very much. Alexander originally, when he takes over, he comes across the Hellespont again, now the Greeks coming to attack the Persians. Alexander blitzkriegs down through what we would call modern-day Syria, and he is making his way to Jerusalem. Maybe you'll remember this story from a few weeks ago. As he's making his way to Jerusalem, he sends an ambassador to the high priest of Jerusalem, saying basically, leave off the alliance you have with the Persians and join me. The high priest says, we can't do that. We're people of our word. We have agreed to support Darius in this war. And so Alexander comes to Jerusalem planning to destroy Jerusalem. Now the high priest, seeing that, decides to meet Alexander before he can get to the city, to plead with him. As Alexander sees the high priest coming to him, and the high priest robed in these priestly garments, Alexander, remembering a vision he had had of exactly that scene, bows down before the high priest and starts to worship him. The high priest puts a stop to that. The high priest welcomes him into Jerusalem. And then what did the high priest do? Do you remember this story? He showed Alexander the book of Daniel, which said that a great Greek king would come and conquer the Persians. Now, because of that, Alexander then offered in the temple sacrifices to the God of Israel. And Alexander offered the Jews great citizenship. In fact, the Jews, every 7th year, because of the Sabbath, didn't have to pay taxes. Alexander took care of the Jews. So Alexander actually doesn't get much of a focus here. A verse for a man who has had volumes and volumes written about him. Why is it, though? It's because God's people are the focus. The focus of Daniel is preparing God's people for the difficulties that they will endure leading up to the coming of the Messiah. Verse 4, and when he shall stand up, again Alexander, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. Well, again, this is a point that we have hit on before, so we're going quite quickly through these. Alexander, about as quickly as he went through Persia and conquered the known world, Alexander died. Most historians don't know exactly how Alexander died, but he was in his early 30s. Now, Alexander died without a clear heir to the throne. Not many kings in their early 30s who think their gods are going to live forever are appointing an heir at that point. So when Alexander dies, there is a massive power vacuum. No one knows who is going to control, who's going to rule over this massive swath of land, the largest kingdom in the world. Verse 4 describes the period of time which is known to history as the Wars of the Diadochi. The Diadochi were the generals and those close to Alexander who were jockeying for power upon his death. Now, these wars involved, in particular, 4 men, who I'm going to notice in just a second. Those 4 men became the leaders of the empire, which was divided up into 4. You see the 4 winds of heaven here. You saw the 4 wings of the leopard earlier. We see 4 over and over again talking about the Greeks. That's because Daniel or Alexander dies. Daniel records the dividing of the kingdom into 4. The generals, to gain that kingdom, went and killed all of Alexander's family. We see that in verse 4. The kingdom shall not be given to his posterity, nor to his dominion with which he ruled, but the kingdom is given to others. These Diadochi, these generals who were leaders, killed his 2 young sons, they killed his wives, they killed his brother who had become a local ruler, and then they killed his elderly mother to wipe out the name and family of Alexander forever. Because as we look at ancient history, usually kings and their sons and their descendants are elevated up to places of rule. And so these generals were smart. These Diadochi were smart. They got rid of those people. Therefore, verse 4 is fulfilled, that none of Alexander's descendants took the throne. After these wars, which weren't immediate, it took a good deal of time, the empire was divided into 4, the 4 winds that you see here. We've mentioned these before. You had Macedonia and Greece, who were ruled by a man named Cassander. Thrace and Asia Minor were ruled by Antigonus. Syria and Babylon were ruled by Seleucus I, and Egypt was ruled by Ptolemy I. Now we move on from here, and this is where the bulk of the passage is, from verse 5 through what we're going to do the next couple of weeks. And beginning in verse 5, there is a focus on 2 of those 4 kingdoms. Why are we not talking about the kingdom of Greece anymore? Why are we not talking about what's happening in Thrace and Asia Minor? Well, because again, Daniel is focused on God's people and what they're going to go through. This isn't a history book. If Daniel's writing a history book, you'd have all these different names, all these different dates. You would have everything that's happening in that region, but this is a prophecy designed to equip God's people for the difficulties that they're about to go through. So now we're going to see 2 kingdoms. And let me give you a framework to hopefully understand all the data that's about to come at you. These 2 kingdoms are the kingdoms of the north and the kingdom of the south. Why are they called the north and south? They're called the north and south because one is to the north of Jerusalem, one is to the south of Jerusalem. Their names come from their relationship to God's people in Jerusalem. The kingdom to the north is the Seleucid Empire. The kingdom to the south is the Ptolemaic Empire. You could call the kingdom to the north the kingdom of Syria, and the kingdom to the south the kingdom of Egypt. Now, the names of the rulers of Egypt are very easy for us because all of the rulers of Egypt, through all of the details we're about to go through, are called Ptolemy. So all the kings of the kingdom of Ptolemaic dynasty are Ptolemy 1 through Ptolemy 8. We'll go through most of those people today. The Seleucid Empire is a little bit more difficult. You have an alternating in the Seleucid Empire between kings named Seleucus and kings named Antiochus. A helpful mnemonic device, and I say this somewhat jokingly, to remember the names of the kingdoms of the Seleucid Empire is Saasasa. I read that in one of my commentaries, and I was like, that's not really all that helpful. But Seleucid, Antiochus, Antiochus, Seleucid, Antiochus, Seleucid, Antiochus. All right, those are the kings we're going to look at. So keep in mind, you hear Seleucus or Antiochus, the kings of the north. You hear Ptolemy, it's always the king of the south. They keep it easy for us there. Now, let's come to the text, verse 5. Let's see how far we can get. The king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Here in verse 5, we're talking about the 2 rulers. The king of the south would be Ptolemy I. The king of the north, who is called a prince here, In the context, it's a prince of Alexander, one of the princes, one of the governors of Alexander, who was made ruler over the kingdom of the north. That would be Seleucus I. So Antiochus, Seleucus I, the king of the north here, the prince in verse 5. Ptolemy I is the king of the south. What does it tell us? The king of the south was strong. Ptolemy I was strong. But Seleucus I was stronger. In fact, during the reign of Seleucus I, he was so strong that he almost conquered all of the other Greek kingdoms. He was encroaching in upon Egypt, and he was close to conquering Egypt before Ptolemy sent one of his sons and some assassins to assassinate Seleucus. Seleucus was assassinated in about 281 BC. At that point, the power is a little bit evened. At that point, Jerusalem begins to be thrown back and forth between these empires. So the kingdom of the north, kingdom of the south. Verse 6, and in the end of years, they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. Now, these are very specific, and it's showing the amazing nature with which God is able to tell us what is going to happen in history. After Antiochus I is assassinated, his son, Seleucus I is assassinated, his son Antiochus I becomes king. Antiochus I is then assassinated, so we've moved on to Antiochus II. We got to skip over some people because they're not really included in this text. But Antiochus II is now the king of the north. The king of the south here is still Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy, after the death of the first Seleucid king, who's very powerful, Ptolemy becomes more powerful because that king was assassinated. Ptolemy raises an army, and he goes north. We could call this the War of Southern Aggression. He goes north up into Syria, and he is conquering Syria, and he does conquer Syria, and he forces the king of the north, which is Antiochus II, he forces the king of the north to enter into a treaty. Now, Ptolemy is smart. Ptolemy doesn't just want a little bit of power. He wants lasting power. And so Ptolemy, as a part of this treaty he makes with Antiochus, forces Antiochus to marry Ptolemy's daughter. Ptolemy has a daughter at this point named Berenice. You see that in verse 6. The end of the years, they join themselves together. They join themselves together in a peace treaty. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north and make an agreement. So Ptolemy sends his daughter Berenice up to Antiochus in the north, forces Antiochus to marry Berenice. Why is that? Well, it's because Ptolemy in the south is wise. He knows that women have a way with their husbands. He believes that by having his daughter marry Antiochus, that Antiochus will kind of become a puppet to his wife, and his wife will remain loyal to her father. Now, Antiochus isn't totally sharp, but he eventually gets this together, and he understands what's going on. In the meantime, Ptolemy dies. The next Ptolemy rises up, and that Ptolemy is very young. Antiochus sees this as his opportunity to reassert his authority. It's a real kind of Games of Thrones situation. He's going to assert his own authority now, and so Antiochus divorces Berenice. We see that in the text. For the king's daughter of the south shall come, make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power. She is divorced. She's divorced by Antiochus. Now, before Antiochus was forced to marry Berenice, Antiochus had another wife. His first wife was named Laodice, the woman for whom the city of Laodicea is eventually named. Laodice doesn't like being divorced by her husband, and when her husband divorces Berenice and comes back to her, Laodice says, okay, I'll marry you again, but she's kind of got her fingers tied behind her back, because what does Laodice do? She gets back at him by killing him. Laodice poisons her husband Antiochus, Laodice poisons Berenice, and Laodice poisons the son that Antiochus and Berenice had together so that that son could not eventually become the king. Laodice herself has her own son, and her idea is that her son is going to become the king. So what happens? She shall not retain the arm, neither shall he stand. So Berenice doesn't retain power. The king of the north, neither shall he stand. He doesn't retain power. His son with Berenice, doesn't retain power. But she shall be given up, and they that brought her, Laodicea, after poisoning the king and Berenice and their son, kills all of Berenice's court. They don't retain power. He that begat her also doesn't retain power, because in the midst of all of this, Berenice's father, Ptolemy, also dies. So all these verses we're looking at, there's a lot of detail, and it seems obscure when you first look at it, but matching it up with history, it fits absolutely perfectly. During this time, the next Ptolemy arises, who was Berenice's brother. Now, as you can imagine, Berenice's brother is probably not very happy with how his sister has been treated. And so, Ptolemy, the king of the south, raises an army. And he takes that army to the north to avenge his sister's death. By the time he gets to the north, the king who he was coming to defeat, which was his brother-in-law, had been killed along with his sister. And Laodicea's son now was the king. Laodicea's son was young. He wasn't ready to do war with the great Egyptian empire. And so let's look and see what happens in verse 7. Out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate. A branch of her roots, the her still is Berenice. What's a branch of her roots? Well, it's an idiom, it's a phrase. Her roots are her parents. A branch out of her parents is her brother. Her brother is now the king. He is the new Ptolemy III. He shall come with an army, shall enter the fortress of the king of the north, shall deal against them, and shall prevail. Her brother raises the army to avenge his sister. He goes up to the northern empire. He prevails, and actually he ends up occupying the capital of the north. The capital of the north at that time is the city that we know as Antioch. Antioch, you might remember from the New Testament. In Acts chapter 11, Antioch is the first city at which Christians were called Christians. So, the north now is occupied by the south. Verse 8, he shall carry captives into Egypt their gods with their princes and with their precious vessels of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years in the kingdom, the king of the north. So the king of the south shall continue into his kingdom and shall return to his own land. Ptolemy from the south occupies the northern kingdom for a couple of years there in the city of Antioch. He emerges victorious. Eventually, he plunders the city and its temple, and he does what Nebuchadnezzar did to Jerusalem. Remember in Daniel chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem. He carries all of the temple gold out of the city. He takes the princes and the nobles back with him to Babylon. Now Ptolemy III has conquered Antioch in Syria. He takes all of the gold and the treasures out of their temple in Antioch, and he carries the nobles back to Egypt with him, probably doing something similar to what Nebuchadnezzar was attempting to do in the early chapters of the book of Daniel. At this time, the king of the north continues, it says in verse 8, longer than the king of the south. The kingdom of the south continues longer than the kingdom of the north. He lived an extra 6 years, so that's just a fact of history. Verse 10, but his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up, even to his fortress. Here in verse 10, we are looking at the sons of the king of the north. After the north has been embarrassed, they've been embarrassed by Egypt for 20 years. Seleucus, who's the king of the north, has two sons. His sons are Seleucus III and Antiochus III. These two sons raise up. First, it's Seleucus. Seleucus raises up, but he doesn't last for very long. Seleucus is replaced by his brother Antiochus III. Now, Antiochus III becomes the first major figure of this section. Antiochus III is called by history Antiochus the Great, and we're just going to call him Antiochus going forward because it's a little bit easier. Antiochus the Great stretches from verses 11 through verse 9. Antiochus the Great is the one who is now coming down to the south. He is going to come and he's going to avenge his father. He is going to avenge the disgrace that they had suffered from the northern empire. At this time, the Ptolemaic dynasty is also turned over. We have the next Ptolemy, which is Ptolemy IV. The king of the south, which is Ptolemy IV, shall be moved with anger, with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. This battle is known to us in history as one of the great battles of these two empires. This is one of the largest land battles that happened in that region in history as well. Tens of thousands of soldiers represented by both of these empires. Antiochus the Great thinks he is going to win. Ptolemy is this young new king. He is coming up. He's angry. And in the battle, Egypt emerges victorious. That's what we see in verse 11. The king of the south emerges victorious. And when he had taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. This again is speaking of the kingdom of the south. Ptolemy goes north upon his defeat of Antiochus III here. As Ptolemy goes north, he comes to Jerusalem. And when Ptolemy comes to Jerusalem, he begins one of the first great persecutions of the Jews during this time. In Jerusalem, Ptolemy brings in a bunch of elephants and tramples tens of thousands of Jews under their feet. The streets ran red with the blood of Jews who were put to death during this time. Ptolemy then goes into the temple. He desecrates the temple. The Jews constantly are back and forth. We're talking about the warring of the north and south, but smack dab in the middle is Jerusalem. On the border of both of these empires is Jerusalem. So Ptolemy IV is not liked well by the Jews. He kills tens of thousands of Jews. He sets forth a great multitude. When he had taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up. He shall cast down many 10,000s. That's what it's talking about. He shall not be strengthened, though, for the king of the north shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. The next king dies, the next king comes around in Egypt. When the previous king of Egypt dies, the next king of Egypt is young, and this is what the recurring theme is through all of this. When a king dies, that's when the next war starts, because the other king thinks, this is my opportunity. So Antiochus the Great is still king of the north. The king of Egypt dies, he's replaced by another king. Antiochus the Great sees this is my opportunity to go back and to reconquer all that I've lost. And so Antiochus does exactly that. He takes his army down to the south. It's described in verses 12 and 13. At this point, an alliance is made, and this is a lasting alliance that will become important in the coming weeks. Antiochus the Great makes an alliance with two other kings. One is Philip of Macedonia, which is in Greece. The other is Hannibal of the Carthaginian Empire. Maybe you remember from Roman history. He makes an alliance with them, and the idea is that together these three kingdoms will conquer Egypt and then conquer Rome. In the background of all of this, we have the rise of the Roman Empire, the rise of the power of the Roman Empire. Carthage is warring in particular with Rome, and so he makes a positive alliance here. Verse 13 talks about the multitude who come to attack now Egypt, and that multitude is these three empires coming together. Now, as they come, they are successful. In those times, verse 14, there shall many stand up against the king of the south, all these three empires. Also, the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. In Jerusalem, this is happening. There begins to be in the city of Jerusalem the formation of two parties, and these parties will be around in Jesus' time. One of these parties that begins to be formed is a more religiously zealous party, a party that is less willing to make an alliance with foreign powers. The other party is a party that's very willing to make an alliance with foreign powers, and that is ready to gain power by buddying up to whoever it is that's ruling them. In the time of Jesus, we see the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who very much represent these two ideas. Now, the religious zealous power in verse 14 rises up to exalt themselves, and it says to establish the vision. Now, what vision is it? Well, it's the vision Daniel has received. They want to establish the vision of the kingdom of the Messiah. But these Jews are a couple hundred years off. They're a couple hundred years off from the coming of Jesus. And so God's kingdom is always going to come around in God's timing. So the kingdom of the Messiah is not established at that time. and they're eventually defeated. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. Speaking of the victory, right? The victory of the king of the north against the kingdom of the south. We might call this war the war of northern aggression. But he that cometh against him, he shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. He shall stand in the glorious land, with his hand he shall consume. He shall also set his face to enter with strength of all of his kingdom, the uprights with him, and thus he shall do. And he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither shall she be for him. Antiochus the Great is victorious now over Ptolemy, and this is Ptolemy the Fifth. Antiochus the Great takes an idea from the past. You remember Ptolemy of old, Ptolemy the Second it was, gave his daughter Berenice and forced the king of the north to marry his daughter. Now Antiochus the Great has the same idea. Antiochus the Great has a daughter, and Antiochus the Great's daughter is named Cleopatra. Antiochus the Great takes his daughter Cleopatra, and that's what it's talking about here in verse 17. He shall give the king of the south one of the daughters of women. This is his daughter. And the idea from Antiochus the Great was that his daughter would sway Ptolemy and that the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt would come under his influence. But that doesn't happen. Cleopatra actually leaves her father behind and cleaves to her husband. Cleopatra becomes allied with her husband, and instead of bringing her husband under her father's sway, Cleopatra convinces her husband to make an alliance with Rome. And so the alliance that begins between the Cleopatras and the kingdom of Egypt and the Romans begins at this time. Now, Cleopatra in this story is not the Cleopatra you're thinking of. The Cleopatra you're thinking of is Cleopatra the Seventh. The Egyptians were not very creative with the names that they gave to their kings and queens. Cleopatra the First is this Cleopatra. Cleopatra the Seventh is the Cleopatra who eventually would have an affair with Julius Caesar and then would ally herself with Mark Antony during the Roman Civil War before she would commit suicide by being bitten by a viper upon their defeat. But this Cleopatra doesn't do what her father had asked her to do. She shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. She doesn't stand on the side of her father. Again, I know this is a lot of detail. This was very difficult to prepare. It's a lot of detail, and it's not the type of sermon that you usually like to preach because I like to teach doctrine and all of these things. But what's amazing here is all of these detailed things we're talking about actually happened. They actually happened, and so specifically that we can identify them in history. After this, he shall return to face the isles and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered upon him to cease. Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the ford of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. Here, Antiochus is embarrassed by his own daughter. Antiochus, when his daughter Cleopatra, it becomes clear she led her husband to ally with Rome rather than himself. Antiochus goes away. He doesn't have the heart to destroy his daughter. He doesn't have the heart to continue to conquer Egypt. He knows if he even tried to, now because of their alliance with Rome, he can't. Rome becomes a major figure here. So Antiochus turns his sight to the Isles, it talks about in verse 18. Here we're talking about the Greek Isles. He does what Xerxes had done generations before. He crosses the Hellespont, he comes to the Greek Isles, and he has this deal now with Hannibal. Hannibal, the leader of the Carthaginians, the great enemy of ancient Rome. The deal Hannibal makes is, I'm going to attack from the west, you attack from the east, we'll sandwich Rome, and then I'll give you Egypt. So that's the deal. Hannibal will get Rome, Antiochus will get Egypt. Well, unfortunately, for all of them, Rome was an ascendant power, and Rome destroyed them all. Antiochus was eventually totally embarrassed by all of this. His navy was totally destroyed by the Roman navy. His army was defeated in battle after battle. He tuck-tailed and turned back. In verse 18 and 19, it talks about the prince that came forth and destroyed him. That prince is Scipio Asiaticus, who was the Roman leader who defeated the Syrian army in this case. So he goes back home totally embarrassed. Verse 19, he turned to the face of his own fort. He stumbled and fell. Eventually, he dies in battle, and he's replaced by his next son, which is another one of the Seleucises. Verse 20, then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. Antiochus the Great is first replaced by his son Seleucus IV. Seleucus IV reigns for a very short period of time. It says that here, within a few days he's destroyed. But when he reigns in that short period of time, Seleucus IV decides that he wants to raise a bunch of taxes to pay off their war debt to the Romans. When they were defeated by Rome, they had to sue for peace. And when you sue for peace, you're basically paying reparations to that country for a long period of time. So Seleucus IV says the only way we can do this is raise taxes. The Jews refused to pay those taxes. They said, your father, Antiochus the Great, told us we didn't have to do it, so we're not going to do it. They refused to pay taxes. So Seleucus IV takes an army, goes into Jerusalem, kills tens of thousands of Jews, plunders the temple, takes the treasure out of the temple, desecrates the temple. Again, this is the third or fourth time it's been desecrated over these 100 years of history we've been looking at, and goes off with this money. Seleucus IV is killed, though, in a very short period of time. He's killed by one of those very close to him. He was destroyed, not in anger, not in battle, but he was assassinated. Verse 21, now we get to the last figure in our story this morning and the first figure in our story for next week. Verse 21, and in his estate, the estate of Seleucus IV, shall stand up a vile person to whom they shall not give honor of the kingdom, but he shall come peaceably and obtain the kingdom with flatteries. Verse 21 here is talking about Seleucus IV's brother. Seleucus IV's brother was Antiochus IV, who is known to us maybe a little bit more closely as Antiochus Epiphanes. So Antiochus Epiphanes is the vile and evil figure in verse 21, and he's called vile because of how he treated the Jews. If you think his brother Seleucus IV was bad, what we're going to see next week about how Antiochus IV treats the Jews is much, much worse. Antiochus IV comes in, he stands up, he is vile, he obtains the kingdom peaceably. When Antiochus' brother died, Antiochus' brother had a son, and that son was to be the next king, but that son was just a child, 5 years old at this time. And so Antiochus comes in, and he says, you know what? I'm going to take care of my nephew. I am going to rule as regent until my nephew is old enough to take the throne. Over time, though, Antiochus gains more and more power, and he usurps his own nephew. He has his nephew sent off as a prisoner to Rome, and Antiochus, through flatteries, obtains the kingdom. Peaceably, he obtains the kingdom. That's what it says in verse 21. With the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. This is speaking now about the work of Antiochus Epiphanes, about what he does after taking over at this point. Antiochus Epiphanes now is going back to wage war against the kingdom of the south. They've been defeated over and over again, but now he finds an opportunity. And he is going down, and now who is ruling in the south but Ptolemy the Sixth? Ptolemy the Sixth here is called the son of the covenant because Ptolemy the Sixth is the son of Ptolemy the Fifth and Cleopatra, whose marriage was a part of the covenant. So he's literally the son of the covenant. In this way, Antiochus IV, if you've been able to keep all of these ridiculous details in your mind together, Antiochus IV is actually the uncle of Ptolemy the Sixth. Because who is Antiochus IV's sister? Cleopatra is his sister. Both of their fathers was Antiochus the Great. So Antiochus sees the opportunity to go down and to conquer his young nephew. And he does so. He goes in there very quickly. He takes over his young nephew, and he is going to make his nephew a puppet king. During that time, he and his nephew actually make a league together. The league made with him, they work deceitfully, for he enters peaceably upon the fattest of the land and the place of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers didn't done, nor his fathers' fathers. He conquers more. He actually conquers Alexandria. None before him had conquered Alexandria. He forecasts devices against the strongholds for a long time. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the kingdom of the south with a great army. The king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall be slain. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief. They shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper. For yet the end shall be the time appointed. Then they shall return to his own land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. He shall do exploits and return to his own land. That's describing what I just talked about. Antiochus Epiphanes conquers his nephew. He makes a deal with his nephew, where his nephew is going to be basically a puppet king. Now, they come to the table deceitfully with one another. The idea that both his nephew and Antiochus had was that eventually they would just kill each other, and one of them would take all of the power for themselves. He returns to his own land until verse 29. Now, we're coming to the end of all of this for this week. At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. In the meantime, Antiochus has returned back to Syria, and Ptolemy the sixth has a new rival. Ptolemy the sixth's brother, Ptolemy the eighth, I don't know why it skips over 7, but Ptolemy the eighth begins to raise a great group of people supporting him. Ptolemy the eighth says, my brother has given up, he's become a puppet of my uncle, and so I declare myself Pharaoh. I declare myself the ruler. Now, in the midst of that, these two brothers end up reconciling because their sister gets them together and says, look, we're more powerful together. We can defeat our uncle, so why don't all three of us join together, create a league with Rome, and then we'll be victorious. So they break off their deal with Antiochus IV. Verse 29 is Antiochus IV's response. He returns with an army, and he comes right up to the borders of Alexandria. He's about to destroy them. At that point, the two Ptolemies and their sister Cleopatra II send off an emissary to Rome, begging Rome to come help. And that's what happens in verse 30, the end of our passage for this morning. The ships of Chittim, which is talking about Rome, shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and shall return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. At this point, Rome shows up on ships. The Roman governor comes out of the ship. He comes up to Antiochus' army, and he commands Antiochus and his army to return back to Syria. Antiochus responds by saying, give me a couple days to think about it. Let me go back, address my nobles, and we'll come up with a response. Now, the Roman governor at that point knows that all Antiochus wants to do is go back to Syria, get a bigger army, and come down and conquer. And so the Roman governor draws a line in the sand. He draws it around Antiochus and his men and says, if you cross this line before you give me an answer, we'll declare war on you right now and we'll kill all of you and your men. That's where we get the phrase drawing a line in the sand from. It's from those events in history. The Romans draw a line in the sand around Antiochus IV and his men. And so Antiochus IV and his men do what only they could do and say, okay, we won't continue. They turn back and they go to Syria. Now, this is the point where we're going to get to some more interesting, more applicable information to what you might be familiar with. But that's going to be next week. On Antiochus' way back, it's already 11:44. On his way back, Antiochus is incensed. He's angry. He's been embarrassed. He's been told off by the Romans. And so, like many people do when they're angry and embarrassed, Antiochus takes out his anger on somebody. And right in his way, on his way back home, is the city of Jerusalem. The abomination of desolation takes place right after that. We will see that next week. I want to end with this, okay? All of this is great and good, right? The history is interesting. for most people, probably glaze over. Okay? But this shouldn't just be history to us. This should do something to us. The Word of God is alive, active. All of it is profitable for teaching, for rebuke, for correction, for training in righteousness, including a passage like this, which may have been hard to listen to. Lots of detail. It's profitable. What is this passage profitable for? I think it shows us two main things I want you to take away from this today. One, this passage shows us something about the book that we hold in our hands. The amazing detail I'm able to go into, filling in the prophecy of Daniel, shows us something about the book in our hands. What does it show us? It shows us that we can trust everything that this has to say. It shows us that this is not some mere book, but this book contains the very word of God that is true in everything that it says, meticulously so. Verse by verse, we can trust all of it. It shows us something about the book, but more importantly, it shows us something about the God behind the book. Many religions have many books. Many religions have their many false gods. I began by reading from Isaiah 46. Is there any other God like me who can declare the end from the beginning? What's the difference between this book and any other book? What's glorious about this book is not the paper it's written about on. It's not the nice leather in the back of it. It's not the length of it. It's not even Daniel. What's glorious about this book is the God who is behind it. Why all of this can come to pass, why all of this does come to pass, why we can trust every word of this book is that it finds at its source the true God. The God who is true in absolutely everything he does, who declares the end from the beginning. Ultimately, we're going to see next week and the week to come that all of this is pointing to Jesus. You can trust the testimony of our God, and our God gives all of this to prepare the way for his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. If you can trust what happened with Scipio Asiaticus and the 18 different Antiochus and Seleucuses and the Ptolemies, if you can trust that, by God, by his word, by his truth, you can trust what it has to say about Christ. Daniel looked to Christ. We look back upon Christ for one thing, for hope, for the hope of his people, for salvation, for the establishment of his kingdom. There's great importance here. So I want to keep that in mind. Keep that in mind as we continue. And we're going to turn towards kind of Christ beginning next week and then in the following week. But this word is true. It's sure. And I hope that this lesson, which indeed has been very historic, right? I hope that it is served to strengthen your trust in the Word of God and your trust in the God who is behind that Word. Let's pray.